Throughout most history, Japan has been heavily influenced by China in terms of culture, philosophy, law, just to name a few. Well, this all changed after the Meiji Restoration when Japan came to see China as old and weak against Western powers. Back in 1894, the small power of Japan faced the colossal Chinese Empire in the Sino-Japanese War. Fought over the Korean Peninsula, this war would be the ultimate test between the two powers and their respective modernization projects. And trust me, it was an absolute steamroll campaign for one side of the conflict. During the 1880s, the bond between Japan and Korea's Chosun dynasty worsened, as Korea leaned more and more towards its conservatism. In 1894, the pro-Japanese Korean leader Kim Il-kyun, who was involved with the Gapsin coup a decade previous, was assassinated in Shanghai. The aftermath was a bit of a grisly affair, as authorities in Shanghai decided laws against extradition did not apply to corpses. His body was subsequently shipped to Korea and paraded around its provinces, serving as an example of what would happen to those that dared support Japanese influence, just to give you an impression of the domestic hostility between the pro-Chinese and pro-Japanese camps. There even was a senior post created by the Qing in Seoul, held by Yuan Shikai, furthering Chinese presence on the peninsula. Yuan's primary objective was to uphold China's privileged status in Korea and ensure that Japan did not gain a foothold. After all, historically speaking, Korea was China's most important tributary state. Throughout the 90s, Japan's influence on the peninsula became more prevalent, and tensions kept rising, and then the Tonghak peasant revolution broke out and swept over Korea. This revolt, induced by a religious sect, was a direct threat to the Korean monarchy and its King Gojong. Now, Tonghak was a sect that opposed anything westernized, and the uprising started as such, anti-Japanese and anti-Western in its aim, but it quickly deteriorated into an all-out civil war. Several areas of Korea became rebel-controlled and the rebels advanced onto Seoul. The government of King Gojong, rather frightened, immediately requested military aid from their ally, the Qing dynasty. The Qing sent around 2,700 soldiers to the peninsula in order to protect the royal family. Now, if you've watched my video about the geopolitical situation preceding the Sino-Japanese War, you might remember that 10 years ago, an event very similar to this one occurred on the peninsula, namely the Gapsin coup. Both China and Japan sent troops to the Korean Peninsula following this failed coup, but they eventually agreed that both countries had to withdraw all their troops. They were only allowed to send their troops to Korea if they notified the other party first. Seems like a clear agreement, right? Well, the Qing sent their troops without notifying Japan, violating this Tientsin Treaty. When Japanese Prime Minister Ito Hirobumi got wind of this, he called a special meeting. There it was decided Japan would send a much larger force, the Oshima Composite Brigade. Japan was able to mobilize and transport troops at a fast pace, rendering China's time advantage useless. Around 4,000 Japanese troops landed in Korea in early June, only 2 days after the Qing troops landed. Skirmishes erupted around the countryside, though nothing too serious yet, and the Japanese troops managed to quickly move up to Seoul, Korea's capital. And the Tonghak Rebellion? The reason China and Japan sent their troops to Korea? Well, it was rather quickly suppressed by a mixture of Korean and Qing troops under Yuan Shikai's command. That wasn't the end of the fighting, though. Actually, it was just the beginning. The Japanese commander in Korea, Otori Keisuke, received explicit orders to remain in Korea for as long as possible. Liu Zhang, the prominent Chinese statesman, attempted to resolve the conflict with diplomacy, but to no avail. When King Gojong was presented with a list of reforms by the Japanese troops in Korea, he instead demanded the Japanese withdraw their force from Korea altogether. It would take less than a month for the Japanese to decide to seize King Gojong, after he had refused to carry out reforms multiple more times. Japanese troops seized the Korean palace in Seoul on the 21st of July and installed a regent loyal to their interests. Officially, it was only the 1st of August 1894 that Japan declared war on China. That did not mean there was an absence of skirmishes and hostility, however. The First Sino-Japanese War would be the absolute test regarding the results of the Chinese self-strengthening movement and Japanese modernization. It makes an interesting case for the comparative analysis between both countries, both embarking on their respective modernization projects. On the 25th of July, the first naval battle of Pundo was fought. The Japanese Naniwa, under the command of Captain Togo Hayachiro, sunk 3 ships and caused over 1,000 casualties. The amount of casualties had something to do with the Japanese refusal to rescue the Chinese sailors after their ship was sunk. 4 days later, the Battle of Asan was fought on Korean soil. It was the first overseas battle Japan had fought in over 300 years. Japan was once again victorious, although the majority of Chinese soldiers managed to escape and meet up with the rest of the Chinese army at Pyongyang. Meanwhile, soldiers from both sides were still pouring on the peninsula. China had dispatched over 20,000 Chinese soldiers into Korea, and the Japanese, under General Aritomo Yamagata, had landed on Incheon with their goals to speed through the Korean land. On the 16th of September, the two armies met at Pyongyang for the first time since the official declaration of war. The Japanese attacked Pyongyang from several directions, overrunning the Chinese defenders under General Ye Zichao. The Chinese suffered very heavy losses compared to the Japanese, 500 to 7,000 casualties. Qing forces were decisively defeated in a series of battles around Seoul and Pyongyang. The Japanese were able to advance northward. Not much later, Wei again met Qing forces at the Battle of the Yalu River. Japan emerged victorious once again, now officially entering Qing territory. It had been a steamroll campaign no one had expected, with Qing forces suffering defeat after defeat. Yamagata's First Army crossed the Yalu River undetected during the night, routing Chinese guards on outposts in Manchuria. While part of Yamagata's army under General Katsura Taro pursued the routed Chinese forces, the other part under General Nozu Michitsura advanced towards the city of Mukden. While Yamagata asserted his dominance in northern Korea, a second army corps under Oyama Iwao landed on the Liaodong Peninsula, capturing the last strongholds of the Chinese army and laying siege on Lushunkao, better known as Port Arthur. Within 4 weeks it was captured. What followed was the infamous Port Arthur massacre, where Japanese soldiers wreaked havoc on citizens and soldiers still residing in the port. Though difficult to calculate the amount of Chinese slaughtered, it is estimated these number in the thousands, if not tens of thousands. In effect, it meant that Japan had asserted its complete control over Korean territory within 2 months. Japan's land forces could now enter China proper. Well, the Qing government was pestered by extreme institutional corruption. What transpired with its fleet makes that all too clear. The Japanese fleet under Ito Sukiyuki and Tsuboi Kozo faced the Chinese Beiyang fleet under Admiral Ding Ruchang and Liu Bushan. The Beiyang fleet was in a dreadful condition due to extreme corruption among its leadership. Consisting of at least 2 battleships, 10 cruisers and 2 torpedo boats, it had faced a Japanese assault at the Yalu River in September. Suffering losses, though no extremely mortal wounds, the fleet retreated to the heavily fortified port of Weihaiwei. There the fleet would lay dormant behind a curtain of protective mines, not participating in any battles. It ensured the Japanese gained control over the Yellow Sea and boosted the morale of Japanese troops and the home front even more. It also severely upset the balance of power in the region, in China and internationally, and inspired a rivalry among imperialist powers competing to encroach on China's periphery. The Beiyang fleet lay dormant in the port of Weihaiwei, but on land, the Qing forces were beaten back by the advancing Japanese. The land forces retreated to Weihaiwei as well, but, according to Jonathan Spence, surprised by the rapid advancement by the Japanese, they were outflanked by a brilliant maneuver of Japanese forces on land and by the fleet under Admiral Ito Sukiyuki. The siege of Weihaiwei followed, in which the Japanese suffered minor losses, although a Japanese Major General, Odera Yasuzumi, did die during the fighting. After 23 days of sieging, the Japanese forces seized the Weihaiwei defensive forts from the landward side. As Japanese troops entered the town of Weihaiwei, several Chinese sailors mutinied. The Chinese Admiral Ding Ruchang took his own life, together with his deputy Liu Bushan and the senior Qing commandants of the forts, turning the guns on the Chinese fleet whilst penetrating the minefields with torpedo boats. The Japanese destroyed whatever was left over of the Beiyang fleet, although, admittedly, this was barely anything. The Battle of Weihaiwei was the last major battle of the war. China simply did not have a fleet anymore. They truly suffered defeat upon defeat. It was total chaos. Peace negotiations were instigated. Throughout the negotiations, there were several skirmishes between Japanese and Chinese troops, although none noteworthy. China truly was a beaten nation. On the 17th of April, 1895, China could do nothing but sign the peace treaty of Shimonoseki. The disgraced Prince Gong was approached by the Qing court, just as he had 35 years before after the Second Opium War, when the Summer Palace had been burned. He is noted as lamenting to a Western diplomat that he had been given the job of piecing together the cup, which the present ministers have smashed to the floor. I don't think he was too wrong about that. Assisting Prince Gong was Liu Hongzhang, sent as a Chinese envoy to Japan, tasked with signing the treaty acknowledging the independence of Korea. Korea instantly became a de facto Japanese protectorate. Now, this Treaty of Shimonoseki was absolutely disastrous for China. It is interesting to note that these terms would have been even worse had a Japanese assassin not shot at Lee while he was negotiating the treaty in Japan. Aside from Korea's independence, it ceded, in perpetuity, the pescadores, Taiwan, which now would remain a colony of Japan until 1945, and the Liaodong Peninsula of southern Manchuria. China had to pay an indemnity of 200 million silver taels and grant Japan commercial and industrial privileges on its territory, a right that was only reserved for European powers up until now. It had to open 4 ports and allow Japanese to manufacture locally in China. Japan suddenly gained access to an enormous market and could invest even more capital into the modernization of its industries. Due to the shift in the balance of power, Russia feared for its sphere of influence because Japan suddenly gained the Liaodong Peninsula, harboring the very strategically located Port Arthur. Russia had set its own eyes on the peninsula, and it managed to get Germany and France to support its protests. Together, they managed to force Japan to relinquish its claim. Under this triple intervention, Japan's arm was twisted into retroceding the Liaodong Peninsula back to China. Port Arthur would be the crucial port during the Russo-Japanese War 10 years later, but for now would cost China an additional 30 million silver taels. In order to pay off these debts, China had to borrow money from a foreign power against terrible rates. Russia got Russian and French banks to loan China about half of the amount required to pay its indemnity to Japan. A year later, in 1896, Russia managed to get a concession from the Chinese to build the Trans-Siberian Railway through Manchuria to Vladivostok, which was more efficient than building it through Russia's own territory. The fact that China allowed Russia to build a railroad through Manchuria would have far-reaching consequences, however. In the end, the Sino-Japanese War and China's humiliating defeat marked the dark conclusion of China's hopeful attempt at self-strengthening. After Russia gained permission to build their Trans-Siberian Railway across Manchuria, they negotiated a secret Russo-Chinese Treaty of Alliance, also known as the Lee-Lobanov Treaty. In short, this meant both countries had to come to each other's aid in case of Japanese aggression. Well, a year later, Russia took it upon themselves to send a naval squadron into Port Arthur, and in 1898 they received a 25-year lease for the entire Liaodong Peninsula, which would be vital during the Russo-Japanese War, only 7 years away. They basically abused their newfound alliance with China. The Qing dynasty's weakness had been exposed after the Sino-Japanese defeat. The fact that Russia obtained their ice-free port and managed to connect it via railway to Europe convinced the other European powers they had to act quickly to maintain their own sphere of influence. France, Britain, and Germany started encroaching onto the Chinese periphery, and sometimes straight-up seized ports and trading posts. The practice was pretty much in line with modern imperialism common during that time. A more detailed overview of this scramble for concessions will be outlined in my video about the Boxer Rebellion next week. And as for domestic politics in China, the defeat was extremely humiliating and caused a rift between the conservatives and the progressives. There was no way around it. China, once center of the world, was on the back foot. In Beijing, China's brightest young scholars had gathered around, unanimously denouncing the Treaty of Shimonoseki and demanding a new modernized and stronger program of economic growth and governmental reform. I don't want to spoil too much, so if you're interested in what happened with the Qing dynasty the following years, make sure you subscribe and check back next week, or check out the playlist on the screen right now detailing the downfall of the Qing dynasty from the Taiping Rebellion all the way into the 20th century. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.